This is my project on sustainable cities and communities in Singapore. We're going to be talking about the sustainability problems that come with bringing sustainability into the cities and talking about ways in that I feel like are good suggestions into how to fix these problems. So next is just kind of like an introductory. Singapore is known to be a very green city. 95% of the energy that is used is from natural gas, and it is in the top 20 of the most sustainable carbon efficient countries. It also has, is not on here, but there's even a law for reducing waste, which is you can't chew gum in Singapore. You can only buy mints. The next thing I want to talk about, well, the first thing I want to talk about is solar power in Singapore. If you see here on the graph that I have, you will see that solar power generation didn't really start till kind of recently in the last 10 years. As you see in 2011 is when you start to see the surplus of solar power being used. Solar power is said to be the most reliable clean energy source in Singapore, and it is said that the goal is by 2030 to have 350,000 households use solar power. But the only problem is that Singapore, smog and stuff like that come from the other countries, that is kind of a problem, which can be a big problem when trying to set up these solar power panels. So here's the graph for the USA versus Singapore when it comes to solar power generation. As you see in green at the top is the United States, and in red is Singapore. Singapore, like I said in the last slide, didn't start their solar power until like 10 years ago. And the United States, as you can see, already started implicating that in the early 1980s. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is CO2 emissions. You can see in Singapore, it's placed 126th out of 142 countries in the use of CO2 emissions, which is really good. So as you can see, it really started to take a peak in the 90s when new things like airplanes and that such use more CO2 emissions. But in the next slide, we're going to compare the US versus America, or the US versus Singapore. So as you can see here, it doesn't look that good for the United States. You can see, obviously, like in the last graph in green is the United States and in red is Singapore. You can see that the United States use a lot more cumulative CO2 emissions from gas. And you see it started to be a big thing, especially with the industrial revolution. And during that time, you could see that it was really high of CO2 emissions. So I didn't come up with that many solutions, but these are three that I think that are really important of ways to improve sustainability in Singapore. One of the things is pushing for more ways to be sustainable in building architecture. A lot of the architecture already in Singapore is very sustainable, but pushing obviously for more is not a bad thing either. Improving public transportation. In Asia in general, the public transportation system is really good, but it does cause a lot of CO2 emissions. So not reducing, but finding more sustainable ways, and then also reducing waste. Like I said earlier in the beginning, about the law that you can't chew gum in Singapore, that is a perfect example of how to reduce waste. But finding different ways to get rid of trash is another way to get rid of CO2 emissions as well.